Why is it that salesmen wait anxiously every month for their sales reports? Why is it that they compare those monthly reports to their annual quotas? Why is it that those speed monitoring signs that flash your speed for all the world to see can change the driving habits of entire neighborhoods? What does Weight Watchers know that caused them to revolutionize the diet industry by requiring monthly weigh-ins for people who were already paying them to lose weight? All three of these real-life examples have one thing in common: the concept of using knowledge of results to motivate people to improve their performance. Welcome to Part 4 of Increasing Their Motivation. In this podcast, we will talk about how knowledge of results can motivate students to improve their performance in the classroom. You will learn the definition and critical attributes of knowledge of results. You will learn why knowledge of results changes motivation. Finally, you will learn what teachers can do to increase students' knowledge of results and thus increase their motivation. The sports world is one place where we all know that improving performance matters. Every athlete searches for better times, personal bests, and new records. The truth is, their constant search is a testimonial to how knowledge of results can improve motivation. Why does knowledge of results motivate people? In Mastery Teaching, Madeline Hunter explained, "When we find out what we are doing well, what needs to be improved, and most importantly, what to do to improve it, and then feel a reasonable probability that we can improve it, we are motivated to try to accomplish that improvement." Hunter's explanation helps us to identify the 4 critical attributes that help us to define knowledge of results. Knowledge of results is the kind of feedback, the amount of feedback, the specificity of feedback, and the immediacy of feedback that students receive about their performance. Each of these critical attributes exists on a continuum, and each of them affects a student's desire to try to improve performance. Let's take a look at the continuums for each of these critical attributes, because they can help us really understand how knowledge of results can increase or decrease our students' motivation. The kind of feedback continuum ranges from no feedback on the lowest end to comments on the highest end, with praise and grades in between. The amount of feedback continuum ranges from no feedback on the lowest end to lots of feedback on the highest end, with little feedback and some feedback in between. The specificity of feedback continuum ranges from no feedback on the lowest end to task-involved feedback on the highest end, with non-specific feedback and ego-involved feedback in between. And finally, the immediacy of feedback ranges from no feedback on the lowest end to prompt feedback on the highest end, with very delayed feedback or delayed feedback in between. Notice that on each of these continuums, the characteristic on the far left will do nothing to increase motivation and may in fact decrease it. The characteristic on the far right of these continuums are like signposts, pointing the way down the path of increased motivation. The more committed teachers are to the characteristics on the far right of the continuums, the more likely they are to increase students' knowledge of results and therefore increase their motivation. Research experts from past to present explain why the kind of feedback we give to students matters. In her book Mastery Learning, Madeline Hunter explains why no feedback results in no motivation. She says, "Just doing something again without knowing how well we did it is not very satisfying or stimulating." In his workshop presentation, Using Assessment to Support Learning, Dylan William describes why praise is also on the low end of the continuum. He says, "Praise leads kids to feel good about themselves, but be unable to do anything. The goal of learning is for kids to be able to do the tasks related to learning goals." In the book Fair Isn't Always Equal, Rick Wormeli explains why grades are not at the top of the list. He says students need feedback and lots of it, but grades are not the best forms of feedback. Grades, by their very nature, are post-learning. If we want students to learn, we can't spend a lot of time using grades as learning tools. Finally, in his book, Instructional Strategies That Work to Improve Student Achievement, Robert Marzano explains why teacher comments are the best signpost to increased motivation. He says, researcher John Hattie reported that providing students with specific information about their standing in terms of particular objectives increased their achievement by 37 percentile points. This finding led Hattie to remark, the most powerful single innovation that enhances achievement is feedback. This chart presents us with an interesting and thought-provoking question. Many teachers believe that grades provide motivating feedback to students. Wormley points out that grades communicate the end of learning, and therefore aren't likely to motivate improved performance. An interesting piece of research from Australia asked the question, if you give students both a grade and comments on an assignment, which do they look at first? The answer, according to researchers, was the grade. Next, researchers posited, if you give students both a grade and comments on an assignment, which do they look at second? The answer, surprisingly, was the other students' grades. You see, the students in this study knew that once they had received a grade, the learning was over. At that point, all that mattered was the grade. If comments are the most effective kind of feedback, does the content of the comments matter? In a December 2007, January 2008 educational leadership article titled Feedback That Fits, learning coach Susan Brookhart says it does. She tells us that teacher comments should always be task-involved, and tells teachers that 3 kinds of comments can really make a difference in motivation to improve learning. One kind of comment that improves student motivation is describing the student's work. For example, you can say, your topic sentence and concluding sentence are clear, and they go well together. Teachers can also comment on the process the student used to do the work. For example, they can say, can you rewrite that sentence so it goes better with the one before it? Finally, teachers can relate work back to the learning goal, so the student can see the progress toward the goal. For example, the teacher might say, did you notice that you have all the names capitalized this time? We've really been working on correct capitalization, and it looks like you've got it. Brookhart strengthens this advice by pointing out that general praise, like good job, or ego-involved comments like, you have great handwriting, don't help the learning. Such comments might make students feel pleased that you approve, but they also will make students unsure about what makes good learning, and therefore unable to replicate it. Research clearly indicates that when a teacher's verbal or written comments meet the criteria for amount, specificity, and immediacy, student learning improves. So how much feedback is enough? There is no magic answer to this question. Researchers use words like frequent, but avoid numbers. For example, in his book Fair Isn't Always Equal, Rick Wormley says, the wise teacher spends time using frequent and substantive formative assessments, and then finds time to consider the results of those assessments and make instructional changes accordingly. These frequent checkpoints are where students learn the most. They also allow teachers to give lots of feedback that influences learning and changes the course of their teaching if needed. In his book, The Art and Science of Teaching, Robert Marzano recommends that knowledge of results improves when students keep track of their learning by recording it on learning progress charts, like the one at the left, and student and teacher discuss that progress and how to improve with each formative assessment. In a recent article for Educational Leadership, educational consultant Susan Brookhart also looks at the issue of amount of feedback. She says, probably the hardest decision concerns the amount of feedback. A natural inclination is to want to fix everything you see. To the teacher's eye view, that is where the perfect achievement of all learning goals is. But try to see things from the student's eye view. Are there any assignments coming up that would make it wiser to emphasize one point over another? And what about the student's developmental level? These three experts help us to see how complex the issue of amount of feedback really can be. For the last several years, renowned researchers have been telling us how powerful frequent formative assessments are when it comes to improving student achievement. The variables of motivation explain why this is true. As you listen to these podcasts, you will notice that nearly every one of them mentions frequent formative assessment as a way to improve motivation and therefore improve learning. In the case of knowledge of results, it's an amount issue. The more often a teacher assesses knowledge and skills, the more often he or she will give students feedback about their results. In this case, more really is better. Knowledge of results isn't, however, just about giving students lots of verbal or written comments about how they did. The issue of specificity matters too. Specific feedback tells students what they are doing well, what needs to be improved, and what to do to improve it. For example, if you've got a young student who's finger painting, you might want to give this kind of feedback. Look, you've got red, blue, and green, all three of the primary colors from the finger paint pots. Now you just need to use them to make a picture of your favorite toy. Look for the criteria for specificity. Was this student told what she's doing well? Does she know what needs to be improved? And does she know what to do to improve it? If you're helping a student with a writing assignment, you might give this kind of a comment. You've listed all the significant details of the Civil War. Now you just need to organize them for meaning. For example, you might write about them in chronological order, order of time, or in order of importance, most important to least important. You can pick the organization you like. Instructional coach and educational expert Susan Brookhart examines yet another aspect of specificity. She says feedback should be specific enough that the student knows what to do next, but not so specific that you do the work. Identifying errors or types of errors is a good idea, but correcting every error doesn't leave the student anything to do. Remember that motivation is defined as the student's intent to learn. Just knowing what they did well doesn't change their intent to learn. However, knowing what needs to improve, and even more important, knowing what to do to improve it, can have a major impact on motivation. One might think that immediacy is self-explanatory. Assessment guru James Popham didn't agree. He said that immediacy means students know within an hour the correctness of their responses. An hour seems like a reasonable amount of time until you pair it with the many tasks teachers ask students to do every day, and then overlay that with the different kinds of feedback teachers can give. For example, can a teacher really give students any kind of feedback on homework in an hour? How many teachers can grade all the copies of a test or quiz and give students feedback on their performance in an hour? What about writing comments on 125 research papers? Can a teacher really do that in an hour? Assessment guru Dylan Willem says that immediacy means American teachers may have to change their work habits. He says that in order to give immediate feedback, teachers must spend 2 times as much time planning for instruction. That means creating formative assessments and organizing feedback opportunities as they do grading papers. Currently, however, most American teachers do the opposite. Educational consultant Susan M. Brookhart, author of How to Give Good Feedback, looks at the issue of immediacy from yet another point of view. She says teachers should put themselves in their students' places and ask, when would a student want to hear feedback? She says the answer is always the same, when the student is still thinking about the work. Immediacy of feedback does matter. Think of it as prime time to improve motivation and learning. Teachers need to plan effective ways to give students feedback as quickly as possible. So how can you put this all together and know where to start? All 4 critical attributes are important. It might help to summarize what you know about knowledge of results. Of course, in this chart, the human variable is missing. How many summative grades will you give? How fast can you turn those grades out? How many verbal comments will you have time to make during class or during a conference? Will you make time to talk to each student more than once? How fast are you at writing comments on a set of papers? How many comments will you take the time to write on each paper? If you are committed to doing whatever it takes to give students the knowledge of results they want and deserve, then what should you change about the way you give feedback to students in your classroom, especially if you want to use knowledge of results to improve their motivation? Based on what you know about knowledge of results, which of these teaching strategies might improve knowledge of results for students in your classrooms? Asking hinge questions that all students are required to answer during a lesson and giving specific immediate feedback related to those answers. Giving frequent formative assessments with immediate feedback and having students track progress toward learning goals. Scheduling frequent student-teacher learning conferences to give oral comments related to class assignments. Changing grading procedures to eliminate zeros, use equal measures of central tendency for grading, and emphasize formative assessments with comments as preparation for summative assessments with grades. Writing teacher comments, but no grade, on a product or project. And giving students ways to self-check homework or independent practice. Just remember that doing any of these things will help, and doing many of these things will help more. What have you learned? If you can answer the 4 questions on this concept test, you are beginning to understand how knowledge of results can improve motivation in your classroom. Number 1, what is knowledge of results, and how does it impact motivation? Number 2, what are the 4 critical attributes of knowledge of results? Number 3, what do the continuums for the critical attributes tell us about how teachers can use knowledge of results to improve motivation? Number 4, pick 2 specific teaching strategies you could use to improve knowledge of results and describe how you might use them in your own classroom. Now that you know more about knowledge of results, which variable of motivation will you study next? Open any remaining podcast to learn more about increasing their motivation.